The jungle doesn't care about your rank. It doesn't respect your training or your doctrine. In the fall of 1942, on a volcanic island most Americans had never heard of, the jungle became the proving ground for a new kind of warfare. And the men who stumbled through it learned that survival belonged to whoever could endure longer, dig deeper, and fight meaner than the enemy across the wire. Guadalcanal was never supposed to matter. A speck of coral and kunai grass in the Solomon Islands chain, it sat in the backwater of the Pacific Theater, forgotten by most strategic planners until Japanese engineers began carving an airstrip out of its interior. That airstrip changed everything. Whoever controlled it could dominate the sea lanes, stretching from Australia to the Japanese home islands. And so, in August 1942, the 1st Marine Division stormed ashore in America's first major offensive of the war, a gamble born of desperation and stubbornness in equal measure. The Japanese called the Marines Rikusentai, naval infantry, the same term they used for their own landing forces. But within weeks, that label proved insufficient. The soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army who arrived to retake the island coined new phrases, words scrawled in captured diaries and intercepted intelligence reports. Kichiku Bei, American devils. Yabanjin, savages. And later, as the jungle fighting ground on and their own casualties mounted into the thousands, a quieter term emerged among the veterans, Shinigami, reapers of death. These weren't the scripted propaganda slogans Tokyo broadcast to its people. These were the private admissions of men who had seen something unexpected in the dense thickets of Guadalcanal's interior, something that violated every assumption the Japanese military had made about American willpower. The 1st Marine Division that landed at Guadalcanal was not a refined instrument. These men were trained, yes, but green. Most had never heard a shot fired in anger. They came ashore expecting resistance and found none. The initial landing was almost surreal in its ease, the beaches empty save for scattered construction equipment abandoned by Japanese laborers. But that silence was deceptive. Within days, the Marines dug in around the half-finished airstrip they would rename Henderson Field, and the island began to reveal its true nature. The heat was atmospheric weight made tangible. Temperatures climbed above 100 degrees beneath a canopy so thick it choked off any breeze. Humidity hung at 90% or higher, turning every uniform into a sodden second skin. Men lost pounds of water weight in hours. Malaria mosquitoes swarmed at dusk. Dysentery swept through companies, leaving Maroons too weak to stand guard duty. Rations ran short. Resupply convoys were turned back by Japanese naval forces prowling the surrounding waters. And still, the order stood, hold the airfield, whatever it costs. The Japanese response came swiftly. Tokyo ordered the Ichiki Detachment, 900 crack troops under Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki, to retake the island and annihilate the American invaders. Ichiki's men were veterans of campaigns in China and the Philippines, hardened by years of jungle warfare. Ichiki himself drafted a plan predicated on a single night assault, a bayonet charge across the Ilu River, straight into the marine perimeter, overwhelming the defenders through sheer audacity and speed. Skies that weaponized stratospheric altitude where Luftwaffe engines choked on thin air. Factories that outproduced the entire Reich economy 20-to-1 at peak, delivering 823 P-47Ds monthly from 5 dispersed plants. And American national character that transformed illiterate plowboys into aerial wolves who fought not for glory, but for the simple arithmetic of going home to wife and child. Even after Luftwaffe technical teams swarmed dozens of P-47 crash sites from Chartres to Arnhem, dismantling turbochargers, measuring wing chord lines, interrogating captured pilots, analyzing gun camera films of Johnson's kills, even after witnessing his seemingly supernatural deflection shots firsthand through binoculars, Luftwaffe High Command couldn't comprehend the weapon they faced, because true understanding would have forced a single, terrifying admission echoing across every Geschwader. Air superiority wasn't slipping, it was mathematically lost forever. The skies belonged to the factories now. Our anchor through this aerial Armageddon, Johnson himself, the Iowa farm boy turned double ace who saw what Prussian-trained Experten like Marseille, Galland, and Meyer refused to acknowledge. P-47 Thunderbolts didn't fight the Luftwaffe's elegant dogfighting war of tight Luftbrücke circles and nose-to-nose scissors. They fought America's war of industrial arithmetic, high-altitude geometry, and ruthless practicality. From Guernica, 1937, through the Channel Dash, February 1942, the Luftwaffe owned Europe's skies with near religious certainty. They wrote the actual book on air power, Manfred von Richtenhofen's tactics codified in every JG-26 and JG-52 Ordnungsbuch. Achieve local 4-to-1 superiority through Jagddivisionen concentration, bleed heavy bombers dry 100 kilometers from targets, force abandonment of daylight raids through attrition. The math bore them out brutally. Spain, 800 Republican planes downed. Poland, 1,200 kills in 36 days. France, 1940, 1,800 Allied fighters destroyed. Battle of Britain, 10,000 RAF planes claimed, 2,500 confirmed. By Dieppe, August 1942, they'd forced RAF Bomber Command onto moonless nights over the Ruhr, trading 4,000 Lancasters and Halifaxes for 3,000 German night fighters. The fighting didn't end at the Ilu River. It metastasized. What the Japanese High Command initially dismissed as a minor setback became a hemorrhage they couldn't staunch. Throughout September and October, Tokyo poured reinforcements onto Guadalcanal. First, the Kawaguchi Brigade, then elements of the 2nd Division, then the 38th Division. Each wave arrived with the same objective: crush the Marine perimeter and reclaim Henderson Field. Each wave discovered the same brutal truth: the Americans would not be moved. The Kawaguchi Brigade's assault came on September 12th, targeting a ridgeline south of the airfield that would later bear the name of the Marine commander who held it, Edson's Ridge. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson had positioned his 1st Raider Battalion and 1st Parachute Battalion along a narrow spine of high ground, knowing the Japanese would come through that corridor. He was outnumbered nearly 3-to-1. His men were exhausted from weeks of combat and disease. Ammunition was rationed to 10 rounds per rifle. And still, Edson told them simply, "We're here to hold this ridge. They're coming to take it. Let's make sure they pay for every foot." They paid in blood measured by the gallon. The Japanese attack began after nightfall, wave after wave of infantry surging up the slopes, illuminated by flares and the muzzle flash of desperate Marine fire. The raiders and paratroopers fell back twice, contracting their perimeter to avoid being flanked, but they never broke contact. When Japanese soldiers breached the line, Marines met them with bayonets, rifle butts, and entrenching tools swung like medieval axes. The fighting devolved into something primal, men grappling in the mud, too close for rifles, killing with hands and blades and rocks. What shattered Japanese morale wasn't just the casualties, it was the realization that the Marines fought hardest when cornered. Japanese doctrine emphasized the spiritual power of the offensive, the belief that attacking spirit could overcome material disadvantages. But on Edson's Ridge, that philosophy met its antithesis: men who absorbed punishment, gave ground only when tactically necessary, and counterattacked with a ferocity that matched or exceeded anything the Imperial Army could muster. Captured Japanese documents from the period reveal a shift in tone. Early intelligence reports described the Marines as poorly coordinated, dependent on firepower to compensate for lack of skill. By late September, those assessments changed. One battalion commander wrote that the Americans displayed unexpected tenacity and fought with the recklessness of men who do not fear death. Another noted that Marine units, even when reduced to half strength, continued offensive patrols rather than consolidating defensively, a pattern that violated Japanese expectations of how a depleted force should behave. The toll of progress became visible in the faces of the men holding the perimeter. Malaria felled more Marines than bullets. At the height of the campaign, 75% of the division was infected. Men shook with fever while standing watch. They hallucinated during patrols. Doctors dispensed quinine and atabrine, but supplies ran low, and the disease cycled through companies in waves. Dysentery turned routine daily functions into ordeals. Jungle rot ate through boots and skin alike, leaving ulcers that refused to heal in the perpetual damp. And yet, the line held. Henderson Field remained operational. Marine dive bombers and Army Air Force fighters flew missions against Japanese convoys, sinking transports and turning reinforcement runs into suicide missions. The Tokyo Express, the fast destroyer runs that ferried troops and supplies down the slot under cover of darkness, took mounting losses. Every ship sunk was another battalion that never reached the island, another load of artillery shells that never arrived, another incremental advantage for the defenders. The Japanese soldiers who did make it ashore found themselves in a war of attrition they were doctrinally unprepared to fight. Imperial Army training emphasized decisive battle, the climactic engagement where superior spirit and tactical audacity would shatter the enemy's will. Guadalcanal offered no such climax. Instead, it delivered grinding, incremental combat where survival depended on logistics, disease resistance, and the ability to endure conditions that stripped men down to their most fundamental drives: food, water, sleep, and the small comfort of knowing the man in the next foxhole wouldn't abandon his post. By October, the breaking point arrived not through a single battle, but through cumulative collapse. Japanese forces on Guadalcanal were starving. Supply lines had been severed by American air superiority. Troops resorted to stripping bark from trees and boiling it for sustenance. Disease ravaged their ranks as thoroughly as it did the Marines, but without the logistical infrastructure to treat or evacuate the sick. Men died in foxholes, their bodies left to rot because survivors lacked the strength to bury them. The final major Japanese offensive came in late October, a coordinated attack by elements of the 2nd Division aimed at overwhelming the Marine perimeter through sheer mass. For 3 days, Japanese artillery, laboriously hauled through the jungle and positioned with extraordinary effort, pounded Marine positions. Then came the infantry, attacking in human waves that recalled the tactics of World War I, each assault expecting to be the one that finally broke American resistance. Each assault failed. Marine artillery, directed by forward observers who called fire missions while under direct attack, shattered Japanese formations before they reached the wire. The M1 Garand rifle, semi-automatic and capable of sustained rapid fire, gave individual Marines a rate of fire that Japanese bolt-action rifles couldn't match. In close combat, the advantage was measured in seconds. The time it took to chamber another round, to acquire another target, to decide whether to shoot or save ammunition for the next wave. The Marines didn't just survive these attacks, they counterattacked. When Japanese forces punched a salient into the perimeter, Marine reserves moved forward and pinched it off, encircling and annihilating the penetration. The tactical flexibility that had seemed like chaos to Japanese observers revealed itself as controlled aggression. Small unit leaders empowered to make decisions, adapt to changing conditions, and exploit enemy mistakes without waiting for orders from above. The psychological impact on Japanese survivors was profound. Diaries recovered from dead soldiers describe a growing sense of futility. One private wrote, "We are told the Americans are weak and cowardly, but they fight like devils and never retreat. Our officers promise victory, but we see only our friends dying in the mud." Another entry dated November 3rd simply states, "There is no hope here, only the jungle and the enemy's guns. That despair was the unseen cost of the American defense, not just the physical casualties inflicted, but the spiritual demoralization of an enemy who had been taught to believe in their own invincibility. The Marines didn't destroy Japanese forces through technological superiority alone. They broke Japanese confidence through relentless, unyielding presence. Every morning the sun rose on Henderson Field, still in American hands, was another day the myth of Japanese unstoppability eroded a little further. The heritage of Guadalcanal wasn't written in the official histories first, it was written in the silence that followed. When the Japanese High Command finally ordered evacuation in February 1943, pulling their surviving forces off the island under cover of darkness, they left behind more than 30,000 dead. The Marines had suffered heavily, 7,000 casualties, a quarter of the division, but they had held, and in holding, they had rewritten the calculus of the Pacific War. What the Japanese soldiers said about the Marines at Guadalcanal became a kind of oral tradition within the Imperial Army, passed from veteran units to fresh replacements in whispered conversations that contradicted official propaganda. The documents tell the story Tokyo didn't want told. A sergeant from the Kawaguchi Brigade, captured after being wounded on Edson's Ridge, told his interrogators, "We were told the Americans would surrender when pressed with the bayonet. Instead, they met us with bayonets of their own. They fought like men defending their home ground, though this island is 10,000 kilometers from America." Another account, pieced together from battlefield journals, described the moment a Japanese platoon encountered a Marine patrol in the dense jungle near the Guadalcanal River. The Marines didn't retreat to call for support. They didn't break contact and fall back to a defensive position. They attacked immediately, closing the distance and engaging at ranges so short that neither side could use grenades without risking their own men. The Japanese platoon leader wrote, "Their madness is a weapon. They charge when they should withdraw. They stand when they should run. This is not the American soldier we were trained to fight." That madness, as the Japanese termed it, was actually something more calculated, a Marine Corps doctrine that emphasized aggressive action as the default response to contact. Where other militaries taught troops to establish a base of fire and maneuver, the Marines taught immediate assault. The theory held that in jungle warfare, where visibility was measured in yards and reinforcement was difficult, seizing initiative through violent action gave a psychological edge that outweighed tactical caution. On Guadalcanal, that doctrine was proven in blood. The term Shinigami, reapers of death, emerged not from a single incident, but from the cumulative weight of encounters where Marines refused to behave as defeated men even when tactically surrounded or numerically inferior. A company of Japanese infantry encircled a Marine platoon near the Tanaru River in early October, expecting surrender. Instead, the Marines fortified their position and called in artillery on their own coordinates, preferring to risk American shells than guarantee Japanese capture. When the barrage lifted, the surviving Marines counterattacked through the stunned Japanese lines and rejoined friendly forces. The Japanese company commander's report described the incident as evidence that Americans valued death in battle above life in captivity, like our own warriors, but without honor or discipline. That assessment missed the point entirely. The Marines didn't seek death. They sought victory through whatever means produced results. If that meant calling fire on your own position, you did it. If it meant staying awake for 72 hours straight because your sector couldn't be trusted to anyone more exhausted than you, you stayed awake. If it meant crawling through a river infested with crocodiles to flank a Japanese machine gun nest, you got wet. The calculus was brutal and simple. Every Japanese soldier killed was one less obstacle between you and going home. The industrial might that backed the Marines became its own psychological weapon. Japanese forces on Guadalcanal watched American supply deliveries with a mixture of awe and despair. While they starved, the Marines received sea rations, ammunition, medical supplies, and eventually even beer and cigarettes.
Henderson Field, which the Japanese had bombed repeatedly and shelled from offshore battleships, was repaired within hours of each attack, graders and bulldozers filling craters, engineers relaying pierced steel planking, work crews laboring through the night so that dawn sorties could launch on schedule.
A Japanese artillery observer, positioned in the hills overlooking the airfield, kept a detailed log of American construction activity. His entries grew increasingly demoralized as the weeks passed. They build faster than we can destroy. For every plane we shoot down, 2 more arrive. They have turned this jungle into a fortress with machines we cannot match. The final entry, dated January 12, 1943, simply reads, "We cannot win this war." That realization, that American industrial capacity could overwhelm Japanese tactical excellence, spread through the Imperial Army like a contagion. Guadalcanal was the first campaign where Japanese forces faced not just American soldiers, but the entire apparatus of American production. The factories in Detroit churning out trucks, the shipyards in California launching transports, the farms in Iowa growing the food that kept Marines fighting while Japanese soldiers ate grass. The human machine wasn't just the individual Marine with his rifle, it was the network of support that kept him supplied, reinforced, and confident that if he held his position, relief would come. The breaking point for Japanese morale came not in a single dramatic moment, but in the slow accumulation of small defeats. Every patrol that failed to return, every banzai charge that broke against Marine defenses like waves against a seawall, every morning when the rising sun flag did not fly over Henderson Field. By December, Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal had stopped asking when reinforcements would arrive and started asking when evacuation would begin. The evacuation itself became a final humiliation. Tokyo dressed it up as a strategic redeployment, a tactical withdrawal to more defensible positions. But the men who boarded destroyers in the dead of night, leaving behind their weapons and their dead, knew the truth. They had been beaten not by superior numbers or better tactics, but by an enemy who simply refused to quit. The Marines had absorbed everything the Imperial Army could deliver: artillery, naval bombardment, infantry assault, disease, starvation, and remained standing. What the Marines took from Guadalcanal was something more valuable than territory. They took proof that American forces could meet the Japanese on equal terms in the environment they knew best: the jungle, the night, the close-quarters brutality of island warfare, and prevail. That confidence rippled forward through every subsequent Pacific campaign. At Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, Marines went ashore knowing that Guadalcanal had already answered the fundamental question: could they break the Japanese will to fight? The answer was yes, if they were willing to pay the price. The heritage that Guadalcanal created wasn't about glory, it was about capacity. The capacity to endure, to adapt, to grind forward when every rational calculation suggested retreat. The Japanese had expected Americans to fight like Europeans, with concerns about casualties and public opinion constraining operational decisions. What they encountered instead were men who fought with the grim determination of people who understood that some things couldn't be negotiated or compromised. The airfield had to be held, the island had to be secured, and if that required living in mud and fever and constant danger for 6 months, then that was the price. The toll of progress extended beyond the men who fought. Every family that received a telegram from the War Department, every community that dedicated a memorial plaque, every generation that grew up in the shadow of what their fathers and grandfathers had accomplished in the jungles of the Pacific. Guadalcanal became shorthand for a specific kind of American determination, not the loud, boastful patriotism of propaganda, but the quiet, lethal competence of professionals doing an ugly job because no one else would. When Japanese veterans of Guadalcanal were interviewed decades later, many described the campaign as the moment they first doubted their nation's inevitable victory. We had been told we were unbeatable. Then we met the Marines, and we learned what it meant to face men who believed they were unbeatable. The difference was they had the factories and the will to prove it. That will, forged in the crucible of Guadalcanal, became the template for American military culture.
the expectation that when faced with impossible odds, you don't ask for permission to succeed, you find a way or you die trying. The Marines who left Guadalcanal carried that lesson into every subsequent battle, and it became the inheritance of every generation of American warfighters since. The jungle doesn't care about your rank or your doctrine, but it remembers who stood their ground when the night came alive with screams and gunfire. It remembers who adapted, who endured, and who walked out when it was over. Guadalcanal remembered the Marines, and the Japanese soldiers who survived learned to speak their names with something that sounded almost like respect, grudging, bitter, but undeniable. Shinigami, the reapers who would not be moved.